Dr. Ken Stoll had prepared a big surprise for his wife Caroline to celebrate her 44th birthday. That night, they went out for dinner at a romantic restaurant, and afterward they took a drive on the highway. At one point, Ken pulled the car over to the side of the road to reveal the surprise gift he had gotten for Caroline. Excited, Caroline eagerly awaited to see the gift. But suddenly, another car stopped in front of them. In the blink of an eye, gunshots were fired at them. The incident was baffling and deeply puzzling, especially since the investigators couldn't determine a clear motive for the crime. The evidence was scarce, leaving them with more questions than answers. However, with a bit of persistence, the detectives uncovered secrets and shocking revelations that helped them find the first clue and unravel the strange mystery behind the crime. On a November night in 1999 in Orange County, California, a patrol officer was driving along Ortega Highway. This highway is usually quiet and not very busy. While driving, the officer noticed a car parked on the side of the road. What caught his attention even more was that there was blood on the outside of the car and one of the windows was shattered. When the officer approached the vehicle, he found two people inside the front seats, and it was evident that they had been shot. The officer quickly reported what he had discovered. Police officers arrived at the scene at around 10:30 p.m. and the first thing they noticed was that the driver's side window was shattered and the car engine was still running. The investigators were able to quickly identify the victims inside the car using the IDs they had with them. They were Dr. Ken Stoll, 57, and his wife Caroline Stoll, 44. Both had been shot multiple times at close range. What exactly happened that night? And what was the motive? At that moment, the investigators needed more information about the couple to figure out what led to the crime and identify the perpetrator. They learned that Dr. Ken Stoll was a renowned anesthesiologist and his wife Caroline was an ophthalmologist. The couple had been married for 14 years and had no children from this marriage. However, Dr. Ken had a son, also a doctor from a previous marriage. Investigators also found out that the day before the crime, Caroline had told her mother that her husband planned to take her out to celebrate her birthday. She mentioned that he had hinted at a big surprise for her but wouldn't reveal what it was. On the night of the incident, Ken and Caroline went to their favorite restaurant for dinner. Afterward, Ken drove the car out of the city and onto the quiet highway. Unfortunately, that was where their lives tragically ended when they pulled over to the side of the road. However, there were a few strange and illogical details about the scene that caught the investigators' attention. The first question investigators asked was, why, doctor? Ken and Caroline had taken that specific route, especially since it was in the opposite direction of their home and outside the city. While examining the car, they noticed that Dr. Ken was still seated in the driver's seat with his seatbelt on. In contrast, Caroline was sitting in the passenger seat unbuckled with her door open and her right leg outside the car. It appeared as though she had been trying to escape. This stark difference in their reactions raised questions. Caroline seemed to have attempted to flee, while Dr. Ken remained in his seat, still buckled in. Investigators also observed that Caroline's purse was still in the car, along with Dr. Ken's wallet and their expensive watches. This made it clear that robbery was not the motive. This led to the theory that Dr. Ken might have been trying to end both their lives, starting with Caroline. This would explain why she tried to escape while he stayed in his seat. However, this theory was quickly dismissed because no weapon was found at the scene. The coroner recovered about 10.38 caliber bullets from their bodies. Since there were no shell casings at the crime scene, investigators concluded that the weapon used was a revolver. At this point, detectives hoped to uncover more evidence to understand what had truly happened. Police searched the streets surrounding the crime scene, but unfortunately found no eyewitnesses or the murder weapon. The motive remained a mystery. Investigators then decided to review Dr. Ken's landline call records. They discovered that he had received 5 calls from the same number on the day he died. Upon further investigation, they identified the caller as Adriana Vasco, a 35-year-old employee of Dr. Ken. Curious about the frequency of her calls, the detectives decided to speak with Adriana. However, before meeting her, they contacted Dr. Ken's bank to check for any unusual transactions in the 2 weeks leading up to the crime. Their inquiry revealed that Ken had withdrawn $30,000 from his account approximately 2 weeks before the murders. Could this large sum of money be connected to the crime? Investigators decided to speak with Adriana Vasco, as she might have insights regarding Dr. Ken's $30,000 withdrawal. Adriana told detectives that she had worked as a receptionist for Dr. Ken since 1992 for about 8 years. She explained that she called Dr. Ken on the day of the crime because she was having issues with her computer and he was helping her resolve them. She claimed to have no knowledge of why he withdrew the $30,000. At this point, her answers didn't provide any significant leads, and the mystery surrounding the withdrawal remained unsolved. The case gained widespread media attention, becoming a headline story in newspapers. This prompted a man named Richard to contact the police, saying he had something important to share. Richard was a maintenance worker who had worked for Dr. Ken for years. Whenever something in the house needed fixing, Dr. Ken would call him. Richard described Dr. Ken as a friendly man who enjoyed having conversations. One day, while fixing the home alarm system, Richard recounted a strange conversation with Dr. Ken. Caroline wasn't home at the time, and Dr. Ken started making unusual remarks. Eventually, he outright asked Richard, "Could you get rid of my wife?" and even offered him money to do it. At first, Richard thought it was a joke, but it soon became apparent that Dr. Ken was serious. He believed Dr. Ken had approached him because of his past. Richard had previously been involved with a gang, but had turned his life around. Realizing Dr. Ken wasn't kidding, Richard refused the offer. Not only did he reject it, but he also tried to dissuade Dr. Ken, telling him that such thoughts were wrong and urging him to abandon the idea altogether. Richard's account baffled investigators. If true, it suggested the possibility of a hired killer. However, this theory didn't fully make sense, given that Dr. Ken himself was also murdered. To verify Richard's claims and uncover more details, detectives decided to dig deeper into the relationship between Caroline and Ken. This discovery led investigators to realize that the seemingly happy couple, Dr. Ken and Caroline, were far from content in their marriage. Their public image of happiness was merely a facade to maintain social appearances. Behind closed doors, their relationship was crumbling. Caroline had been considering divorcing Ken, but his mother convinced them to try couples counseling instead. Caroline, who had already gone through one failed marriage, didn't want to face another failure. She genuinely tried to work on their relationship. 4 months before the murder, Dr. Ken underwent a risky heart surgery, and Caroline stayed by his side, taking care of him. The root of their marital issues appeared to be Dr. Ken's infidelity. Caroline had reportedly discovered his numerous affairs, which became a major source of conflict between them. Armed with this new information, investigators focused on Adriana Vasco, the receptionist who had called Dr. Ken 5 times on the day of the murder. They began to suspect there might have been a romantic relationship between her and Dr. Ken. When detectives confronted Adriana about this, she initially denied any affair. However, under pressure, she eventually confessed. Adriana admitted to having an affair with Dr. Ken that had lasted for years, almost as long as she had worked for him. Approximately 8 years. According to Adriana, Dr. Ken despised his wife but was afraid to divorce her because she would take a significant portion of his wealth. Adriana claimed that while Dr. Ken often expressed his hatred for Caroline, he never mentioned wanting to kill her. Their affair ended when Caroline discovered the relationship. However, Dr. Ken continued to financially support Adriana, and she remained close to him despite having a new boyfriend. Digging deeper, investigators discovered that Adriana had been romantically involved with multiple men while still having a relationship with Dr. Ken. One of these men told detectives that Adriana had hoped to convince Dr. Ken to leave Caroline and marry her. However, Dr. Ken had no intention of divorcing Caroline, which frustrated Adriana immensely. This provided a potential motive for Adriana. Investigators obtained a search warrant for her home, where they found several photographs of Dr. Ken and Caroline, along with some pictures of Adriana with a man they didn't recognize. When detectives asked Adriana's workplace supervisor about her, they learned that Adriana deeply hated Caroline and often referred to her using derogatory names. The supervisor also identified the man in the photographs as Tony Sutton, a maintenance worker at the building where Adriana lived. This revelation added a new layer to the investigation. Who was Tony Sutton, and what role, if any, did he play in the murder? During the investigation, a shocking discovery was made. Adriana had visited a gun shop with one of her relatives. While they were browsing the guns, she told her relative, "This gun looks just like the one I bought for my friend Tony." This raised suspicions. Who was Tony, and why was Adriana buying him a gun? Police quickly began searching for Tony to question him, but he seemed to have vanished. No one had seen or heard from him since the murders of Dr. Ken and his wife, Caroline. The police issued a nationwide alert to all departments, distributing a photo they had found in Adriana's home. Shortly after, they received a call from a police department in North Carolina. An officer informed them that the man in the photo wasn't named Tony Sutton, as Adriana had claimed. His real name was Dennis Gadley. Dennis, a 30-year-old with a criminal history, was well known to law enforcement for his extraordinary ability to escape and disappear. Further investigation revealed that Dennis already had an outstanding arrest warrant for charges of theft and assaulting a police officer. A year before Dr. Ken and Caroline's murders, Dennis had been arrested for theft in Virginia. While handcuffed and seated in a police car, he managed to escape and vanish completely. However, police eventually tracked him down at his father's house and rearrested him. A few months later, another alert was issued with Dennis's photo and a fake name indicating he was a suspect in another case. California investigators traveled to North Carolina to question Dennis. He admitted to using the alias Tony and confirmed that Adriana was his girlfriend. However, he denied any involvement in the murders of Dr. Ken and Caroline. Meanwhile, in California, police decided to administer a polygraph test to Adriana. She passed all the questions except one, whether she knew who was responsible for the murders. Failing that critical question, authorities decided to arrest her. Adriana was charged with the murders of Ken and Caroline Stoll, a serious accusation that could lead to the death penalty. To avoid this, she struck a plea deal and recounted what had happened that night. According to Adriana, Dr. Ken had been desperate to get rid of his wife for years, with the idea first forming in his mind as far back as 1993. Adriana claimed that she met Dennis for the first time in September 1999, though he had misrepresented himself to her. At some point, she told Dennis about Dr. Ken's desire to get rid of his wife. Dennis expressed his willingness to handle it, but Adriana initially thought he wasn't serious. When Dennis insisted he was, Adriana refused to be involved. But Dennis threatened her and her children, forcing her to arrange a meeting between him and Dr. Ken at a parking garage. Adriana met with Dr. Ken first, sitting with him in his car and taking an envelope of cash he handed her. She tried to warn him about Dennis, telling him that he seemed dangerous and suggesting he abandon the plan. However, Dr. Ken was adamant about going through with it. Adriana took the money to Dennis, and the two men began communicating directly, leaving her out of their conversations. She said they started planning how to execute the crime and make it work. Adriana also mentioned that she tried to convince both Ken and Dennis to abandon their plan, but Ken was insistent on getting rid of his wife. She explained that she couldn't go to the police and tell them what was happening because Dennis was threatening her and her children. On the day of the crime, Adriana spoke to Dr. Ken on the phone, still trying to change his mind. That night, Adriana tried to avoid Dennis, but he showed up at her apartment with a gun and forced her to accompany him to carry out the plan. Together, Adriana and Dennis got into the car, drove to a gas station, and waited until Dr. Ken's car passed by. When Dennis saw Ken's car, he followed him until Ken parked his car at the agreed-upon spot. Dennis then parked in front of Ken's car, got out, and approached Ken's vehicle with the gun. Adriana said she heard gunshots and Caroline screaming, which terrified her. She thought of running away but was too scared because Dennis had the gun. Dennis returned to their car, reloaded the gun, and seemingly did so inside the car to ensure the casings wouldn't fall outside. He then told Adriana to stay in the car while he went back to Ken's vehicle and fired more shots. According to Adriana, Dennis reloaded the gun again because Caroline was still alive and moving. Dennis told her afterward that he had also shot Dr. Ken, the man who had paid him to commit the crime. Dennis explained that he killed Ken to eliminate any witnesses, and because he thought Ken was foolish for paying the entire agreed amount upfront before the crime. Adriana also claimed that Dennis later threw the gun into the ocean. Now, 3 years after the crime, Dr. Ken's lover Adriana Vasco and her boyfriend Dennis Gadley were both facing the death penalty. Adriana decided to do a television interview where she admitted to cooperating with Dennis but claimed he had forced her to be part of the crime. She also said she never believed he would actually go through with the murder. The judge seemed sympathetic to Adriana, ruling that her confessions to the investigators were inadmissible in court because they were made under duress, violating her constitutional rights. However, in court, Adriana continued to insist that Dennis had coerced her into participating in the crime by threatening her and her children. Despite this, the jury found Adriana guilty, arguing that she could have reported Dennis to the police, who could have protected her. On January 24, 2003, Adriana was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. She avoided the death penalty because of her plea deal. Dennis, on the other hand, was convicted 6 months later of all charges and received the same sentence, life imprisonment without parole. However, about a year later, in 2004, Dennis dropped a shocking revelation, claiming that he only killed Dr. Ken and that Adriana was the one who killed Caroline. Whether this was true or not remains unknown. Dennis died of cancer in prison in 2012, while Adriana is still alive, serving her sentence. The moral of this story is that Dr. Ken should have chosen the respectable route of divorcing his wife and giving her her rights. This would have been a far better ending than the tragic events that unfolded. What do you think about today's case?